what we can do to address Venezuela's humanitarian crisis, I would start out this discussion by saying that I think that there are two ways of thinking about policy for Venezuela that, at least in the current situation, have been brought forward. One of them is to think about the day after, and there's been a lot of thinking about, well, how is it that we should prepare for transition? How is it that we should, for example, think about international financing? How much money is Venezuela going to need? What are the needs, both financial and of other types of reconstruction? Should we open up the oil sector? All of those issues that would become very important once the transition occurs. And this has come to be known as thinking about the day after, or D-Day. What's remarkable about that type of thinking is that it's a thinking that is completely oriented towards a moment in the future, which makes a lot of sense if you think that that moment is inevitable or that it's going to come very soon. But you start to question it if that moment seems more distant. And I would say that, as opposed to that, there's another type of thinking which is oriented at thinking about the here and now, thinking about, well, we're in the reality of a political crisis. This crisis doesn't seem to be getting resolved, and therefore it's necessary to consider and to think about ways in which we can handle this crisis, we can deal with the effects of this crisis while the crisis plays itself out. So does it imply a certain recognition of the crisis and that the crisis is going to last? Yes, but it's not necessarily by choice. It could just simply be a reflection of reality. And I think that what's happened in a lot of the international community and also in Venezuela over the course of the past several months is that ideas about a transition in Venezuela have gone from being very optimistic to being very pessimistic. So whereas 10 months ago you would find a lot of people who were saying this is just a question of days, weeks, it's going to be over, now you'll find a lot of people saying, well, even if you're optimistic, it's going to take a lot of time, and this is really complex. So back in February, it made a lot of sense to think only about the day after, and I would argue right now it makes a lot of sense to think. I still think that you should think about the day after, but it makes a lot of sense also to focus on the here and now. So let me wait, this way. I don't know how it went far so much in advance. So let me start out a bit from the setting. Now, one question that I have is, if I get up and I'm probably not going to have access to the microphone, and then the sound for the webcast is not going to be that good, is it?
Is the microphone plugged into?
You guys are getting the audio from here, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just remain sitting then. So basically what happens in Venezuela, and just to tell you a little bit about the setting, is that this is an economy that is undergoing the deepest economic contraction in recorded Latin American history. And I say recorded because we have comparable data for most economies of Latin America since 1950, and it's definitely the deepest since then. We also have historical data for Venezuela due to the work of Venezuelan economic historian Batista going back to 1830, and we can also say that the contraction is deeper than any that happened during the 19th century, at least starting with Venezuelan independence. And that means that it's deeper than the one that was suffered through Venezuela's federal war, which was the country's civil war in the 19th century. And in fact, if you look at this globally, it is a very atypical economic contraction for a country that is not undergoing a war. There are a few countries, but very few, that have suffered this type of contraction without undergoing a war. And none in Latin America, again, at least as the data, as far as the data allows us to tell. So let me show you some measures of the intensity here. Oops. Oh, I think I just did something. Okay. All right. So I'm trying to get at the pointer. Oh, I guess the pointer will point to everywhere except the screen. Yes, that tends to happen with these new digital screens. So there are a couple of measures there of the magnitude of the contraction. And this is essentially a measure that compares it with contractions of varying length. So we simply measure between maximum and a minimum of GDP. And what that means is that you can have some episodes which are very long-lived, so very long contractions. And Nicaragua's, which is now number 2, was a contraction that is comparable in magnitude measured by the distance between the maximum and the minimum, between the peak and the trough of the series. But that decline happened over a much longer period of time, of 16 years. In the case of Venezuela, it's happened in a 7-year period. And what that means is that the contraction has been very intense. I mean, you have the economy contracting at a rate of 12% per year during a period of 7 years. This is what makes it particularly atypical. Now, in that, you have a decision that was taken by the U.S. Authorities at the start of the year, where you actually have 2 decisions, which both of them caused the loss of access by Venezuela to U.S. oil markets. And in the context, as I will argue, of a very import-dependent economy where oil provides the main source of revenue, this is something that is bound to have a significant economic effect. Now, I say that there are 2 decisions because the U.S. did 2 things in January of this year. Number 1, it recognized Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela. And number 2, it sanctioned Venezuela's state-owned oil firm, which also by Venezuelan law has monopoly power over the production of Venezuelan oil. So what that means is that you cannot buy Venezuelan oil, number 1, because it's produced by a sanctioned firm, but number 2, because the person who's producing it doesn't have the legal authority to sell it. And this is extremely important. If the Trump administration decided that it was going to lift all sanctions on Venezuela tomorrow, Venezuela still would not have access to U.S. oil markets. Because the Maduro regime is the one that has the ability and the authority to produce the oil, the de facto control over the territory and the oil fields. But the Guaido administration is the only one that has the legal authority to sell that oil in the U.S. If Maduro, suppose that sanctions were lifted and Maduro were to say, okay, I'm going to start shipping oil to the U.S., I'm going to put that oil on tankers, the moment that those tankers start unloading in the U.S., then the Guaido administration will be able to seize the proceeds of the payments related to those imports. Because from the legal standpoint, Maduro is nothing more than a former Venezuelan president in the U.S., and the authorities appointed by him are former Venezuelan authorities, and they have absolutely no right, any more than other former Venezuelan authorities, to control the government's oil revenues. So this is why it's not just an issue of sanctions, and this is why we emphasize that this is more an issue of a political crisis. There is a political crisis in which there are 2 sides that are claiming legitimacy as the representatives of the Venezuelan people. And the international community has taken different positions with respect to this. There are 56 countries that have decided to recognize Guaido. There is a number of countries, a smaller number of countries that have explicitly decided to reiterate the recognition of Maduro. And there's also another group of countries that have implicitly done so by continuing to accept the Maduro ambassadors, the Maduro-appointed ambassadors. So the reality is that this generates a situation that is essentially almost unprecedented. The last time that the United States recognized a government that did not have de facto control over at least part of its territory was in World War II, where it continued to recognize the governments of allied countries that had been occupied by the Nazis. So we don't have much experience to tell us what happens in a country like this. Now the reality is that this is having a significant effect on the Venezuelan economy because it's not allowing Venezuela to access what was, at the time at which the sanctions were imposed, its main oil market. And the question that we're posing here is there a way to overcome this? Is there a way in which we can make sure that those sanctions do not have a negative effect on the Venezuelan economy and therefore on Venezuelan people without giving oxygen to the regime or without increasing the access to resources of the regime. So I want to show you a couple of graphs, and by the way, we're going to post this presentation on our website. I don't know if you can post it also on the Waller website. There's a lot of material here that you can peruse through, and I'm happy to answer questions about any of these slides. I'm just going to show a couple here to drive home some points. This is a correlation between non-oil imports and non-oil real GDP. And this is a very strong correlation. And what this graph tries to drive home is the point that the Venezuelan economy is very import dependent. So if you take away the capacity to import from this economy, you are going to create an economic contraction. This is the reason why the International Monetary Fund, for example, was predicting a contraction of 5% of GDP in December for 2019, for Venezuelan GDP for 2019, as of December of last year. But after the US imposed sanctions and recognized Guaido, they revised that downwards immediately to minus 25%, and then subsequently revised it downwards to minus 35%. So the point here is that for an economy that depends so much on imports and whose main source of revenue is by far oil revenues, then if you cut this economy off from an important source of generation of oil revenues, you are going to deepen an economic contraction. And in fact, in Venezuela, and this graph was actually originally published in a piece that I published in Wola towards the end of 2017. But in Venezuela, what you find is something that is actually quite remarkable, which is that if you look at this economy's contraction, economic contraction over the past 7 years, this economy's economic contraction, it can have, we can have, and there is, a debate on whose fault it is. And I think that in that debate, definitely, the lion's share, if not the whole share of it, lies squarely with the Maduro regime and the Chavez regime also, or with the Chavez administrations, because this essentially comes out of a country that lived through an oil boom, didn't accumulate enough resources during that oil boom, didn't save, and then when oil prices went down, they had no choice but to take the economy through a massive and very contractionary adjustment. But what we see that's interesting is that in this graph, I'm trying to use this pointer again, sorry, that in this graph, you have a contraction in oil exports which are going down through the whole period. So from 2012 up until the most recent data that we have here, which is the most recent central bank data of 2019. And the economy's oil exports are steadily declining, and this explains to a great extent what's happening to the economy. So the economy essentially lost its main source of revenue. So, however, what you find is that at the beginning of this period, the decline was coming from declining oil prices. However, as we go further on in time, what's happening is that oil production was declining. And here's where we get into what has been an extensive debate in which many Venezuelan economists have become involved as to what the effect of sanctions is on the Venezuelan economy. And here I'm going to fast forward, and I'm going to show you this graph, which essentially encapsulates what I think are both of the relevant discussions. So oil production was declining, and it was declining throughout 2016. An earlier graph shows you that it was stable before 2016. And after the adoption of US financial sanctions, then oil production started declining much more rapidly. And there's a discussion in which I participated about what are the causes of this decline in Venezuela's oil production. And different specialists who've looked at this have different views. Some of us would believe that a significant part of this decline can be explained as a result of US financial sanctions. Some other people have argued that little to none of it can be explained by financial sanctions. However, in 2019, we have another decision, which is what I've been talking about, which is oil sanctions and, more concretely, together with Guaido recognition, the loss by Venezuela of access to US oil markets. And that generated an almost immediate drop of 400,000 barrels, 406,000 to be more precise. And in fact, there was a bit of a subsequent drop, which you see later on there. The attribution of this effect, of this later effect to oil sanctions, is not really that controversial. Most people would agree. I mean, while a lot of people would disagree as to whether the previous 800,000 are attributable to sanctions, most people would agree that these 400,000, or at least most of them, are attributable to sanctions. And the timing there, as well as the magnitude, I mean, the fact that 400,000 was exactly what you were exporting to the US, all speak in favor of this interpretation. In fact, if you go to an article which I think reflects the position of those who have been most critical of the sanctions hypothesis, Ricardo Hausman and Frank Musi wrote earlier this year, and I'd like to focus on a quote from that article, which was written when you just had data from March of production, where they write, nobody disputes that sanctions, the 2019 oil sanctions, will adversely affect PDVSA going forward. So there's no discussion about the fact that these sanctions have a significant effect. We may have differences on the estimate of their magnitude, and certainly I think that there's a fair number of people out there who would argue that the majority, the bulk of the decline in oil production is not due to oil sanctions. And that's the reason why, in putting forward this proposal that we're going to talk about today, I'm basically focusing on the lower end of this range. I'm focusing on that 400,000 barrel figure. So the idea is, let's think about this as being, and it's not only because the drop after the imposition of the oil sanctions is 400,000 barrels, but also because this was the magnitude of the US oil market. This was how much oil Venezuela was exporting to the US. So the question is there a way in which we can recover access to that oil market so that we can use it to address the country's humanitarian crisis, and that we can use it to address the needs of Venezuelans. And here, I'd like to go a bit forward here. Actually, before I talk about the agreement, I want to tell you a bit about how I think that we should think about these issues, and that we should rethink the idea of sanctions. Because when I participated along with other academics in this debate about the effect of sanctions, in the end it was actually quite unsatisfactory. And it was unsatisfactory because it seemed to be that if you were saying that sanctions had an effect, then you were giving arguments that were going to be used by the Maduro regime. And that if you were saying that sanctions had no effect, then all those arguments would be better for the Guaido regime. And this actually, I think, led that debate to run the risk of falling into very politicized terrain, but which also wasn't going to change anybody's minds, because generally the people who support sanctions believe that these sanctions are necessary in order to do two things: bring forward the possibility or increase the probability of regime change, and taking away money from the Maduro regime. And both of them were related. If the Maduro regime has less money, then it will be less able to buy the military, to buy off the military and the people who give them the support. So when you step into this debate and say, oh, but these sanctions are harming Venezuelans, understandably, the people who are defending sanctions and the Venezuelan opposition, their reaction to this is, look, I have a knife, and I'm fighting against a guy who's pointing a machine gun at me, and I'm trying to defend myself with this knife. And you're coming in and telling me that I might cut somebody with this, that I might cut an innocent bystander with this knife, and they feel, and worse, you're trying to take away the knife from me, which is going to be my only means of defense. So I think that once we start thinking about it this way, we can think about understanding the effect of sanctions through a different light. Not in terms of falling into the debate as to whether you're for or against sanctions, but rather of taking sanctions as a reality. I mean, they're there. And thinking about how you can design these sanctions, or you can redesign them, in order to mitigate their negative effects on Venezuelan people. So how you can protect those bystanders who might get cut by the person with the knife, or who might also get fired upon by the guy with the machine gun, how you can protect those innocent bystanders from actually being hurt. And this is what has been behind our idea of putting forward this proposal. Thinking of whether there's a way in which we can use the resources that Venezuela was generating previously by exporting oil to the US, and making sure that those resources are used for the benefit of Venezuelans. Because what has been done up until now has been, okay, let's take away that money from the Maduro regime, because the Maduro regime is going to use them for evil things. And of course the problem is that the Maduro regime was using them partly for evil things, but also partly for necessary things, like running the Venezuelan economy, that have links to the well-being of Venezuelans, because a huge economic contraction in the economy is going to generate a decline in Venezuelan living standards. So can we think of a way in which we can redesign this so that Venezuelans will not be hurt, or at least that we can mitigate the effect that these sanctions and this losing off the U.S. Oil market can have on their well-being. And here I go back to the exposition of what our proposal is. The proposal is for what we call a humanitarian oil agreement. And the idea of a humanitarian oil agreement is a mechanism through which Venezuela can regain access to U.S. oil markets, so that it can, and just to do a very simple math here, 400,000 barrels a day times 365 days times Venezuela's current oil price is approximately $8 billion a year. So that we can use those $8 billion for the benefit of Venezuelans, and as a way to attend Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. And can you do this in a way where the money will actually go to benefit Venezuelans, and it will not play into the hands of the Maduro regime, and it will not benefit the Maduro regime, and it will not stabilize the Maduro regime in power. So the idea that we're proposing is that of an agreement that is signed and is subscribed by the parties to the political conflict. And this agreement would involve the possibility that Venezuela could export oil again to the U.S., for which it would also need to be accepted by the U.S. authorities, because it would need the issuance of a general license to allow Venezuelan oil exports to participate in this program, on the condition that the resources generated by it would be used in order to carry out imports of essentials, that is food, medicines, and other essentials to attend Venezuela's humanitarian crisis, through a mechanism that ensures very significant levels of supervision by the international community and a depoliticized system of distribution of the goods inside the country. That is basically our proposal. And you might say, well, is this an oil for food program? And I'm going to, again, fast forward a bit here. There's a lot that I won't be able to tell you about, but we could take it up in the Q&A. You might say, well, is this an oil for food community program? And in fact, the title of this session and the phrasing that I used originally to talk about the idea before it had developed as much as it has in the past few months was that of an oil for food program, and the language used by Nick Kristof and by Senator Murphy has also been oil for food, oil for aid, oil for essentials, or is this something different? And I would say that it definitely has similarities to a conventional oil for food program, but it also has significant differences. And I think that the fundamental difference is that in an oil for food program like what was implemented in Iraq, the international community just has to deal with one government. So at that moment, in 1996, there was no questioning internationally of the legitimacy, well, actually, I should use the word legitimacy, of the recognition of the Maduro, of the Hussein regime. sometimes they even look alike, so and they both have that big mustache. So, but nobody was questioning the recognition of the Hussein government as the government of Iraq, and nobody was questioning that that was the government that they had to deal with. And this has to do with a number of factors, but there was like no organized opposition that had a claim that anybody was paying attention to being the legitimate government of Iraq. So you had a relationship between the international community and one government. Here, you have a relationship between the international community and two governments. And as I've just argued, the relationship with the international community comes into play because of sanctions. And in this case, it's because of US economic sanctions. But even if those sanctions go away, you still have this problem that these two sides need to agree in order to re-access US oil markets. So this means that you don't just need a program, you need an agreement between these sides. This isn't just, the bargaining here isn't going to happen as in Iraq between the US Security Council and the Iraqi government. The fundamental bargaining actually has to happen between Guaido and Maduro in order to reach agreement as to how to implement this program. And the other reason is that there are several, and to a certain extent it's an outgrowth of this, is that in the case of Iraq, nobody questioned the fact that once the food came into the country, it was going to be distributed by Saddam Hussein. I mean, that partly derives from the authority of the Hussein regime over the territory. The international community was focused on the money being spent on food and essentials. So there were UN inspectors who were there at the ports to make sure that that money wouldn't go, that what was coming in, what was in the containers was actually food. But there wasn't an issue about the distribution. In the Venezuelan case, you cannot think of a program like this without understanding that the monopoly over the distribution of subsidized food, of government-subsidized food by the government-owned networks has been a mechanism used by Maduro to maintain his political dominance. And in fact, it has been used as a mechanism to blackmail Venezuelans into supporting the Maduro regime, into turning out government demonstrations, into going out to vote. I mean, you're talking about a government that holds what are nominally elections where people have the right to vote, however, where people are invited, quote unquote, invited to go and register with their card of the fatherland, which is what gives them access to government subsidies right after they come out of voting centers. So there's this political use of the mechanism of food distribution by the Maduro regime, which if you do not take away the monopoly over the distribution of subsidized food from the PSUV apparatus, then this system will not be doing what it can do and what it needs to do in order to solve Venezuela's problems. That's the reason why what we're proposing is a system in which the distribution of food and essentials within the country is depoliticized, where it happens through an independent entity that is not controlled by the Maduro regime, that has significant levels of oversight, and I'll talk about that in a minute, both national and international oversight. So the fundamental idea of the Humanitarian Oil Agreement is that you can use this money in order to buy food and medicines that Venezuelans urgently need. And you can do it in a way in which these resources are not managed by the Maduro regime, and therefore are not used by the Maduro regime in order to support their political machinery. And here I go back to this discussion about sanctions. Because if we think about what the purpose of sanctions is, it's to take away money from the Maduro regime. So if you can create a mechanism through which these resources are administered by impartial and a neutral entity, an autonomous entity, and are not controlled by the Maduro regime, you will have taken those resources away from the control of the Maduro regime. But you will have reduced and potentially offset or eliminated the collateral effects that policy has had on Venezuelans. How am I in terms of time? Have I already gone over?
10, 15 minutes.
I have 10, 15 minutes left? Well, that's a lot. Okay. All right. A bit more about the proposal. So, because this is a proposal for an agreement, then ultimately, I mean, what we can say and what we do in this is the white paper. I brought a few copies here for those of you guys who can kind of run more faster in order to get them. Once we're done, I didn't bring enough for everybody, sorry. But it's available on our webpage, and it's available in both Spanish and English versions. So what we try to do here is imagine the system. Imagine how this system would work. Imagine how you could reach that type of agreement, and how you would make some of these ends, such as depoliticization, how you would make them operational. Of course, that means that we're getting a lot into the design of the program, and that, of course, invites some questions. And it invites criticisms. And as I've said previously, I mean, the purpose of this publication is for it to be criticized. I would like for it to receive all the criticism that it can get, but I would like for that criticism to have one question in mind, which is, how do we either improve on this proposal or come up with alternative proposals that can help attend the basic urgent problem, which is alleviating the suffering of Venezuelans and mitigating the effect that this political crisis has had on their living standards and on their well-being. So when we start thinking and doing through this thought experiment, we basically come up with a number of suggestions. And here, I'd actually like to go to a figure which tells you a bit more. Oops, did I pass it already? A bit more of the structure of how. Oh no. Oh, here it is. Okay. Of how we're conceiving of this. So the idea is that you would have an administrative board. This administrative board is the main governing entity. This entity has to be chosen by mutual agreement between Maduro and Guaido, because this is an agreement between both parties. And again, it makes no sense to think of this without the participation of Maduro, and it makes no sense to think of this without the participation of Guaido. When the discussions in the Mesa de Diálogo Nacional, which is the body in which the government has been discussing an oil-for-food agreement, among other things, with the minority opposition parties, came out, one of my first reactions to this is, I mean, it's fine that they discuss it, but until we get Guaido there on the table, this discussion is not going to produce anything meaningful until you really negotiate with Guaido, who has control, and with the U.S., whose support you need in order to implement a program like this. Then yeah, you can design it all that you want, but it's not going to be any closer to actually becoming a reality. So, but therefore, this board has to be chosen by mutual agreement. Now, we can set up some guidelines for it. The people who are appointed to it should be recognized as being professionally competent. They should have experience and expertise in the area of oil, or in the area of social services, or in the area of humanitarian assistance. So we can set up some certain requirements for the credentials. But in the end, there's going to be somebody who has to appoint them. And what we're proposing is that this be done by mutual agreement. Now, that mutual agreement may be hard to reach. And it may be hard to reach. And as we know, for example, with the appointment of an electoral council. Yes, I mean, if there were mutual agreement on appointing an electoral council, then we would have solved a great part of Venezuela's problems up until now. But the fact is that it's impossible, or at least until now, it's proved impossible to get both sides to agree on that, on a number of names to head this institution. So here, one potential solution is that you go to a mechanism where you have an even number of representatives who are appointed by mutual agreement of the Guaido and Maduro administrations, which may end up being, there's half of them are Maduro designates and half of them are Guaido designates. But you have an additional set of members who are appointed by the international community. And this may just be moving the problem one step backwards, because then You say, okay, but the international community can mean many things, and if it means the U.S., then it will be pro-Guaido appointees. If it means Russia and China, then it will be pro-Maduro appointees. Although interestingly, and we can think about international organizations like the UN, although then, of course, there are questions of, say, the UN, who's it closer to? There's an interesting instance to take this type of decision, which is the UN Security Council. And the fact is that in this UN Security Council, there are players who have veto power, and players who have sided with both Maduro and Guaido who have veto power. So if the UN Security Council were to appoint a set of additional representatives, it would be because the US, France, the UK, China, and Russia have converged around a set of names that they believe have the credentials to manage this program impartially. So that would be one possible mechanism for solving this political problem. But the basic principle is we have to solve that problem of how do you appoint something that's accepted by both parties. Now, once you do it, this mechanism has to have the control over sales, it has to have a control over procurement, and it has to have control over the distribution of goods. And here, again, is the difference with the Iraqi program. The Iraqi program was run by the United Nations, which essentially was taking control of overseeing the fact that those resources were going to be used for goods imports. But the Hussein regime was able to choose who it would sell the oil to, it was able to choose who it would buy the food from, and it was able to choose how to distribute it inside the country. And that gave it a lot of power. And in fact, that had a lot to do with the corruption that was uncovered in the oil-for-food program, in the Iraqi oil-for-food program. Because it was that discretionality to assign both oil sale contracts and import purchase contracts to different providers or buyers that gave the Hussein regime the capacity to ask for side payments to be deposited into other accounts. So in our system, we take away that from the Maduro regime. We put it in what we recommend as a system. We put it as under the control of this autonomous body. Can you put this under the control of the international community directly, say the UN? Yes, in principle you could. And I think that there are some of these that entities like the UN could do. Now, there are also some basic fundamental discussions here of national priorities. What constitute necessities? What are the goods that Venezuela needs to import? Are you going to import just food, or are you going to import agricultural inputs to produce food at home? These are decisions that I believe will have a lot greater legitimacy if they are taken by an entity that has a lot of domestic legitimacy. And what better way of having a lot of domestic legitimacy than being appointed by agreement of both sides of the political conflict. The other thing is that international entities might have some expertise in terms of how to buy food, how to distribute it within countries. They definitely don't have any expertise that I know of in terms of how to sell oil. And here is the problem, because if you start looking at expertise outside of Venezuela and how to sell Venezuelan oil, well, you're going to have other oil firms, and you're going to have oil traders, and that would also bring in the question of potential conflict of interest problems. So I think that all of this, that the argument for it all being overseen by this autonomous entity, that should at all times be appointing people who are professionally competent and with the definite specific requirements on their credentials. I think that this argument and this structure makes sense. Now, in closing, I want to tell you a little bit about two things. One of them is on the Iraqi system and also our difference from it. So the Iraqi program has a very bad name, and for good reasons. The Iraqi program led to misappropriation of $1.7 billion. There was a huge corruption scandal. It involved very high-ranking members of the United Nations. And yes, I mean, this is definitely something that it should lead us to think very carefully about designing this type of programs. Now, I would also, by means of comparison, say Now, let's think, for example, about the recent Odebrecht scandal. This been actually a lot more money than what was deviated under the Iraqi oil for food program was paid in bribes by Odebrecht, according to the investigations by the Brazilian judiciary. And definitely this means that this program, that the Odebrecht contracts were associated with huge levels of corruption. Now, the lesson that we draw from that is not that we should stop investing in infrastructure in Latin America, or we should stop giving infrastructure contracts to private sector firms in Latin America because of the Odebrecht scandal. The lesson that we draw from that is we need to redesign the mechanism through which these contracts are allocated so as to minimize the effect of the scope for corruption. And this, in fact, and a great part of, or the starting point for our work comes from the fact that, fortunately enough, this work was done by a commission headed by Paul Volcker, former chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve Board of Governors. In that this was a commission appointed by the UN Security Council to look at what went wrong in the program. And what they found was that they were able to identify the exact mechanisms and to issue recommendations, such as some which I've already implicitly mentioned, such as not letting the government decide who it is that it's going to assign oil contracts to, as a way of stopping that from happening. But also, the other fact that's interesting about the examination of the Iraqi program is that you do find that by the assessment of the Volcker Commission, the amount of resources that were misappropriated was 2.7% of all of the resources directed toward the program. And I don't want to minimize that figure because it was a large number, and definitely we want that to be as close to zero as humanly possible. However, it is nevertheless the fact that the one way to read the Volcker Commission report is as 97% of the resources were going to purchase goods and essential imports for Iraqis. And in fact, when you look at the evidence on living standards, on consumption, on caloric intake, on health indicators, after the launch of the oil for food program, you find significant improvements in all of them, which tell you that the program had positive effects, even though it had this problem. And that's what we need to cure and redesign. That's why, as our starting point, we started out from the design of the Iraqi program. I want to close just with one basic fundamental point, which is that there's also a broader way to think about this program. And it has to do with a variety of initiatives that have been suggested and that are currently under discussion. So, for example, there is right now a law that should be presented before the National Assembly soon. It's been presented by several opposition parties, which is a law that would essentially create the scope for an agreement to purchase oil sector infrastructure with resources lent by CAF, that this is an Andean Development Corporation, which is the multilateral for the Andean region, and that would be administered by the UN Development Program. There is thinking in the international community also about the possibility of using funds owned by Venezuela and that have been blocked as a result of sanctions in order to finance humanitarian imports. So there's a lot of thinking about these initiatives, and this proposal is part of that type of thinking. And to a certain extent, what distinguishes our proposal from those is in the source of the funds. But what that means is that everything that's in here, you can take it as also being relevant to these programs in terms of the procurement and the distribution. The only difference is that here we're saying the money should come out of oil exports, and we're going to find a way to increase those oil exports by regaining access to U.S. oil markets. But there's another reason why this is also relevant to the broader debate, and it has to do with the fact that, and I'll finish up with this comment, and it has to do with the fact that in thinking about the Venezuelan crisis, there are kind of two approaches to thinking about how you generate a transition here. One approach, which was very much favored towards the beginning of the year, is you basically put so much pressure on the regime that you lead it to concede, you lead it to give up, and you get the military to turn on it, and then they have to flee the country, kind of in the way of what happened in Bolivia recently. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is you reach an agreement with Chavismo, you reach an agreement with Maduro, and that agreement requires some type of power sharing. And in fact, the agreement put forward by Juan Guaidó, according at least to the guidelines that were approved by the National Assembly in the Barbados talk, the Norway-sponsored talks, talked about an interim government that would be essentially appointed by both sides. Now, it's also another variety of ways of thinking about the Venezuelan transition, where rather than saying we're going to get one side to win the conflict, you say we're going to find a way in which we can get both sides to agree on mechanisms for coexistence. And what's fundamental about this is moving from Venezuela's current system of zero-sum politics to a system of positive-sum politics, where there are some grounds for cooperation, where both sides can generate initiatives that can generate results for Venezuelans through cooperating rather than by taking sides in the conflict. So one way of considering all of these initiatives is that this is a way in which we generate some oases of cooperation to try to get, and this is true for our initiative, it's true for the CAF initiative, it's true for the use of blocked funds, all of them think about finding ways in which you can get two sides to cooperate. Because continuation of the conflict here it can imply that the opposition wins the conflict. It may also imply that the opposition loses the conflict, or that we end up in a prolonged stalemate in which neither side clearly wins, and in which Venezuelans end up paying the cost. And the idea here is to come up with ways, with mechanisms, with ideas that allow us to ensure that Venezuelans pay as little of the cost as possible of this prolonged political crisis. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Francisco. Before I turn the table over to David, I just want to remind everybody tuning in via live stream that for the next part, the Q&A, if you have any questions for our panelists, you can tweet them to us using the hashtag #OilAgreementVZ. That's hashtag #OilAgreementVZ. David?
Okay, thank you, Jeff. And is it on? Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, Francisco, for this presentation and for your work on this. I really appreciate your willingness to take on controversial issues and deal with them in terms of facts and explanations. Is something that's not always rewarded in discussion of Venezuela. I just have a few brief comments just to get the Q&A started. I don't want to take too much time because I want plenty of time for questions. I just wanted to start by saying that our position at WOLA on sanctions has always been that we're not in principle against them. No, I think that they represent a form of conflict that's stronger than words, but less destructive than military action. And so, and that's it. They need to be taken, looked at closely. We are in principle suspicious of them because of the fact that most research is quite clear that they generally don't work. No, they can have, depending on how they're formulated, they can have significant human costs, and oftentimes don't really have much impact. Most of the research shows that about 2/3 of the time they don't achieve their goals. So I think this paper by Francisco, this issue fits right in with this. It's trying to look at this painstakingly, look at the consequences of these sanctions, and look at how they could be improved, how they could be less damaging to people, and how they could still amount to a form of pressure. Most discussion of sanctions, actually, there's actually not that much discussion of sanctions. Politicians usually they're carried out much more as a form of expression, demonstrating your disdain for a politician or a government without really considering their effects. The 60 years on, the sanctions on Cuba are still strongly supported by many politicians, despite all the evidence that they have not worked or been actually counterproductive. As we said earlier this year when the oil sanctions were rolled out, we said, along with our partners in a press release, we said that these were going to be counterproductive. Apart from the human costs, these were actually going to hit the Venezuelan population stronger, and they were going to end up weakening the population and thereby strengthening the Maduro government. Because this is an economy that's completely dependent on oil production and it has a huge impact on consumption. In fact, this is exactly what has happened over the past 8 months, as these sanctions have grabbed hold. It's really hit the population hard. This has sort of exacerbated or accentuated the exodus of Venezuelans from their country, and of course that exodus, that migration process, it's a process that overselects for people that oppose the Maduro government. This is one of the reasons that Juan Guaido, who still has fairly high levels of support, has a much more difficult time now in mobilizing the population, in part because the population that is there are thinking about their daily route. They're trying to get by day, put food on the table, get health care, secure education for their children. All of these are all-consuming needs and do not leave a whole lot of time for anything else. There's one thing that a century of research on social movements and protests have shown, that is that in contrast to what Karl Marx said in the 19th century, people do not actually mobilize when they're desperate and miserable. They mobilize when they have significant complaints, but they have enough well-being that they can actually take on something in addition to their day-to-day needs. So I think one can plausibly frame this proposal that Francisco has been discussing as a way to make sanctions more effective, as a way to actually target them. Instead of sectoral sanctions, these would be sanctions that target the government. It would continue to make the Maduro government make it difficult for them to continue with an unsustainable model. In fact, it already sort of has, in the sense that they've lifted a number of controls that highly destroyed the economy, but at the same time alleviate the suffering of the people. There's a couple of issues that I would like to float for Francisco to discuss. I think there's been a long debate throughout the 20th century about whether democracies or dictatorships are more economically viable. This debate seemed to have been concluded at the end of the 20th century, the fall of the Berlin Wall. People thought a big democracy, liberal democracy, clearly has the edge in terms of economic growth. More recently, people like Yasha Monk and others have been pointing to the growing economic power of autocracies. The fact that countries like China, Singapore, Turkey, Saudi Arabia have these impressive economic growth records and are quite stable. I think this is an issue we can't really solve here, but the essence of the issue is that oftentimes citizens that are more affluent affluence can relieve tension. Affluence can sort of get people to tolerate the lack of democracy. That's what we've seen in China. That's what we've seen elsewhere. So the question would be, if you can imagine an oil for essentials type program being instituted that actually worked, that wasn't corrupt, and that really relieved pressure on the people while still pressuring the regime, that nevertheless that would sort of diffuse pressure for change, diffuse pressure for a democratic transition. If you add to this the fact that one of the ways that China and other countries have been able to navigate this issue is that digital technology has basically allowed authoritarian governments these days to get beyond the dictator's dilemma. The dilemma that used to be the fact that in a dictatorship, leaders didn't know didn't know what the population actually wanted. They didn't have elections, they didn't have any kind of feedback. Well, now with monitoring, with digital information, it's much easier. And in fact, Venezuela, they've installed the tarjeta de la patria card. So just what would you think about that idea that if this all were to work, well, it could actually just alleviate the pressure, and we would end up with this long-term stalemate that's at least not a humanitarian crisis, but it's still a stalemate. And two more related questions. One is, and these questions aren't entirely consistent with each other, but just trying to think open-mindedly here. There's an issue of politics here. You have to get the United States and Venezuela to agree. The United States controls the sanctions, and then Venezuela, you have the opposition, you have the Maduro government. If there's an oil-for-essentials arrangement, a humanitarian oil agreement that alleviates pressure on the Maduro government, the United States are probably not going to sign that. If there's an arrangement that makes sanctions more effective, the Maduro government's probably not going to sign that. If it's something that, like I think would happen, is it would alleviate the government's control over and the ability of the government to weaponize food distribution, everyone's going to sense that and might not sign on to this. So how do you play that political sort of dilemma there, getting both sides to agree with this, both sides thinking that it's a win-win in some way when they don't usually recognize each other. And then finally, if you had any comments about, and you sort of addressed this, but what relationship this has to a potential negotiated settlement? Is this something that should be kept separate from the political negotiations that were happening through July that could be restarted at some point? Is it something that should just be kept separate from that? Is it something that should actually be on the table and part of the negotiation? Or is it something that should be worked on right now and could actually be a source of trust and relationship building that could then facilitate a political agreement? So I'll just leave it there for those questions.
So we've got about 20 minutes left, so why don't you just take 2 minutes, 2 or 3 minutes to
Sure.
quickly respond to David's comments, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience.
Okay. Thanks very much, David, for those comments. All of them frame very interesting questions. I'm going to start from the first one on whether a system like this, by attending Venezuelans' needs and improving economic conditions, would defuse pressure for change. Well, I definitely think that if there were people who believe that the way to oust Maduro was by that Maduro would leave power when a huge economic crisis occurred in Venezuela, then by now they should have realized that they're wrong. I mean, Venezuela has had the worst crisis that we could have imagined. And I think actually most of us, if we had met 6 or 7 or even just 3 years ago and we had described this crisis, probably most of us would have predicted that Maduro would be out of power. And he hasn't, and if anything, he's actually become stronger. I'll tell you a bit about, I do something contradictory. I'm going to try to answer in 2 minutes and also tell a bit of personal anecdotes. But as many of you know, I was involved in the Henry Falcon campaign, and we were among those who believe that you should contest Maduro at the ballot box, not because we believed in the legitimacy of the process, because we didn't, but because we believed that that was the terrain to which we had to take Maduro. That the terrain of popular approval or popular disapproval was where he was weakest. Falcon did not recognize the results of the elections because of the blatant vote buying carried out by Maduro, using food distribution in order to create incentives for people to vote and to vote in his favor. Now, the reason that I bring that up is that if I compare back with 2012, where Chavez did the same thing. Back in 2012, Chavez was giving out houses. There was not only misión vivienda, but it was called mi casa bien equipada, and that would mean that you would get a house, and that house would have a refrigerator and an oven. It would have a set of appliances there. Some of them even had a TV. So the government was really buying off these votes was very expensive, and people could still and Chavez won that election by 10 points, but then Maduro, who was also because the economy was expanding, but then Maduro Maduro's election with Capriles then, with essentially the same situation, it was much tighter margin, and that's because in a situation in which the economy was undergoing relatively high economic growth, a lot of people could tell the government, I don't care. I mean, you can offer me 1,000 houses. I have my own house. I don't need to take these handouts from you, and I really don't like you guys. Now, on the campaign trail last year, I met with people who told me, and what if you're not right? And what if we vote for Falcón, and then Maduro wins, or he's declared the winner, and then they take away our food? And the first time that I got that question, I tried to answer it. And the second time that I got that question, I decided that I wasn't going to answer it anymore, that it was irresponsible. Because I knew that I had something to fall back on. I knew that I was going to be able to do what I effectively did, which is come back to the US and continue my professional career. Some of those families did not have a choice. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that I think that if we can, through a mechanism like this, take away the control of a great part of food distribution from Maduro, we will have brought Venezuelan political change nearer, not farther. If we can bring into Venezuela $8 billion worth of food, medicines, and essential imports, and distribute them to Venezuelans through a depoliticized mechanism which they recognize and see as not being controlled by the government, and what better way to do that than a mechanism that's overseen by Guaido, that is managed by a professional entity that's appointed by both sides with international oversight, where Venezuelans can have the confidence that they are going to pick up, or that they are going to receive this food, this medicine, without there being a quid pro quo regarding their political action. I think that that is going to have a liberating effect on many Venezuelans, and I actually think that that is going to bring political change much nearer. I would actually say, and perhaps too much based on our experience last year, that I would be afraid. I'm very sympathetic to the people who say that you cannot have a free election with Maduro in power. Because what I am sure of is that you can get a perfectly credible electoral council, you can get international observers, you can have the best rules and the best electoral system, and it will still be the case that those persons who last year were telling me, I don't want to run the risk of endangering the food with which I feed my family and my kids, will think the same thing. So when people have been subjected to this level of blackmail, it is essentially impossible to generate the setting for a fair and free election. So that's a reality. That also means that to the extent, and this comes into your third question, to the extent that we're talking about potential agreements in which ultimately the end of the road is going to be an election, very likely with Maduro in power. And I know that there are a lot of people who oppose this, and I've just given reason why I do think that they have a good reason to oppose them. But it's one thing what you want, and it's another thing what you can achieve. It's very unlikely for the opposition to be able to achieve anything better than through negotiation than an election with Maduro in power. Well, if that happens, then in order to get there, you better take away the power over food distribution from Maduro. Because if Venezuelans, and it doesn't even have to do with his being able to blackmail them, if Venezuelans fear, and they have good reasons to fear, that these subsidies are going to get taken away from them, if they don't vote for Maduro, you're going to get a lot of people who will be forced to vote for Maduro, and international observers will have to count those votes as ballots, because they will have been cast. This gets us a bit to this question, and I'll close here on whether Maduro will refuse this. Yes, I think that Maduro will very likely refuse it, and in fact, I think that the reason why Maduro has accepted some type of oil-for-food program, as has been proposed in the Mesita, has been because he's thinking, well, this is going to be the Iraqi oil-for-food program. And there I would be critical of the parties of the Mesita, which haven't been clear enough in stating that Maduro will not have control over food distribution. And once they bring this into the table, then I think Maduro's going to step back and he's going to say, hey, that's not the program that I wanted. So I think that ultimately here there's going to be a negotiation, and maybe this negotiation ends up with Maduro saying, no, if it's like that, then I won't take it. And in that sense, what this will have done is that it will have made very clear to Venezuelans that Maduro's excuse that Venezuela's humanitarian crisis cannot be solved because sanctions are blocking the access to food and medicines is false. It's a lie. And if you look, now I know that a lot of people say to me, well, I knew that they were lying. Everybody knows that. Why do we need to show that again? Well, read through Venezuelan public opinion surveys. 64% of Venezuelans believe that they have personally been impacted negatively by sanctions. So if you don't find a political narrative here, or you can go to Maduro and you can go before Venezuelans and tell them, hey, you're saying that you can't import medicines because of sanctions. Here's the mechanism. Let's go, let's do it, let's sign it, so that you can bring in all the medicine that you want, but you can't have control over it. Unless you do something like that, there's a very strong risk that this sanctions issue will turn against the opposition. And my last comment in reaction to David's comments is, I think that the correct way to think about negotiations here is, yes, I mean, we may be building a stepping block of cooperation, which has to do with some type of negotiating solutions, but I think that ultimately, what we really need to see this is as designing some rules of engagement for the political conflict. Venezuelans should not have to suffer the consequences of the political conflict, and both sides and the international community have the responsibility of designing rules that will protect Venezuelans, and in particular vulnerable Venezuelans, from the effect, from the collateral effect of this political conflict. And in that sense, I do think that this requires rethinking the Barbados approach of the Norway facilitated talks. Because that approach was based on the idea that you had no agreement until there was agreement on every point under discussion. That's something that works for some other types of negotiation, but not here. I think that here, essentially have to cordon off the humanitarian sector and say, we can go on with discussions in the political sphere, but we're not going to condition a humanitarian agreement to the resolution of the political negotiation. And I do think that would be a very significant step that the international community could push for here, and that Norway could take, who are the ones who have been facilitating the talks, to open up a separate track of discussion on humanitarian initiatives, which is separate from the political negotiation. I think that if you do just that, and you start discussing this type of things there, you could make a lot of progress towards alleviating the suffering of Venezuelans.
Thank you, Francisco. Now let's take a couple of questions from the audience. If folks want to raise their hand and state their name and affiliation, we can take a round of questions now. In the absence.
Yep. Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Jake, and I'm a grad student over at American University. My question is, considering for a moment the program actually gets off the ground and implemented in Venezuela, thinking about the day after, as you put it at the beginning of the presentation, if and when the sanctions are lifted and Venezuela can go back to start getting the revenues back from oil production, how does the system kind of dissolve in a way that doesn't create a shock to the supply of food and medicine that's being brought in through the system?
Thanks. Any other questions? I wanted to take a question from Twitter. This is from Amir Vichani. Under this program, would all of Venezuela's oil exports be destined for food, or would the government be able to direct a chunk of it for refined product swaps and debt payments as well?
Okay.
Why don't we start with those two?
Okay, great. First of all, with respect to the first question from Jake, so in principle, if sanctions are lifted, then this program doesn't make any sense. There's no need for it. I mean, that's actually why when some people say, well, but are you advocating for the lifting of sanctions? I say, no, actually, and if this program makes sense because there are sanctions. they're a way of redesigning the sanctions so as to make sure that they don't affect ordinary Venezuelans. However, I do think that while it's true that if the sanctions come to an end, then Venezuela will be able to export all the oil that it wants to the U.S. without any restrictions. So there's no reason why the government at that moment would accept, if it doesn't have to accept any of these restrictions, in order to export oil to the U.S. And this is also a way of thinking, for example, I mean, a lot of people are confused of, well, is it the U.S., but can't you have a program like this? Or wouldn't the government have a program like this with China, Russia, or with Europe? Well, no, I mean, they might have something that they call oil for food. I don't know what that would be. I mean, they might decide to get food from the Chinese in exchange for oil exports, but it wouldn't be this, because this makes sense only when there are sanctions or when there is a legal impediment to accessing these markets. Now, that said, then, it's really interesting to think through a complex transition, because what I've said is probably true for one extreme episode of the transition, which is what I would call a regime collapse scenario. A situation where Maduro and his group decide that they're going to abandon power, they get on a plane and they all leave, and then all new institutions are taken up by the opposition, and you have a government that has, and Guaido comes in, and he has full recognition, kind of like what happened in Bolivia with some differences. So that's one scenario in which I do think that you may be able to get sanctions lifted immediately, and then a program like this might not make sense. But I do think that there are other scenarios in which the transition is negotiated, and in which you really do have a genuine transition. And I go back to the proposal that Guaido himself made in the Barbados talks, according to what he said to the National Assembly, which is a situation in which you have an agreement for at least the transitional power sharing. And if you have that type of agreement, then I think that the U.S. and the international community are going to say, wait a minute, we're not going to lift sanctions immediately, because we have a lot of doubts as to what this is going to look like. I mean, if you're talking about a government that's not a government that's headed by Guaido and Houseman Carlos Vecchio, but it's a government that Guaido might head, but where Diosdado Cabello is defense minister. So what do you think a U.S. bank is going to do when it gets this order to process some payments that is signed by Diosdado Cabello? I mean, they're going to be very hesitant to do it. So I think that but also there are going to be very good reasons to be worried about what this transitional government may end up doing with money. So in that sense, I do think that an agreement like this may also make a lot of sense for a transition. Because to a certain extent, it would say, okay, we're going to accept a negotiation between you two, between both sides, but as long as during that negotiation we cordon off this part of the Venezuelan economy and it's not affected by the political conflict, and we can only essentially devolve the full authority over the control of the use of Venezuelan resources to the Venezuelan government when the Venezuelan government is fully legitimate. And that will happen only after you have a government that has been elected in a free and fair election. And if the transition implies that you have to take a certain period of time, be it 6 months, 9 months, 12, 24 months, before you have that election, then there's very good grounds for maintaining a system like this in the transition. Will the oil for food only be used for food, or could it be used for other purposes? I mean, we framed this as, and in fact, we don't call it oil for food. We don't have the word food in the title and the description of the agreement. We call it a humanitarian oil agreement, and we think that this agreement should allow for the export proceeds to be used to import goods that are necessary for attending Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. We believe that this is that defining this in practice is quite complex, and that it is going to be very difficult to do it ex ante. So there are two instances in our design, both the administrative board and the advisory board. An advisory board is appointed by the administrative board, but it is fully made up of international organisms. So it has no domestic representation. It's made up by representatives of the UN, the Red Cross, Caritas, local NGOs. That between those two, they would actually set the priorities budget. And among those, they would say, okay, we can use it for importing this and this and this. Now, you do get to a really complex issue here with oil production and with oil inputs. And this gets to an issue which hasn't been raised, but it's probably a good moment to raise it, which is that some people express skepticism about this program, saying, but what oil for food, or what humanitarian oil agreement, if Venezuela is essentially not producing any oil? And what I would point to there is, and here I'll actually show you one of the graphs that I didn't show you before, is that if you look at the evidence from Iraq, Iran, and we have other countries in the program, you find that oil production goes down at the moment at which sanctions are imposed. Oil production goes back up and it recovers at the moment at which sanctions are lifted, or in the case of Iraq, at the moment of the start of the oil for food program. In Iran, you also get something very similar. First, multilateral sanctions imposed in January 2012 lead to a significant decline in oil production. After they're lifted, it increases. Once the U.S. reimposed sanctions in the middle of last year, then they collapse again. So this tells you that you should expect for there to be a recovery in oil production at the moment at which you approve a program of this type. Because essentially what it's telling you is, and this is the case that I was building earlier, the fact that you've lost access to the U.S. market is one of the main reasons why you're not producing that much. So once you regain this access, you're going to be able to produce more. So, but I realize and I understand that there are reasons why people would be skeptical and might say, well, Venezuela might be different. And even if sanctions cost it, it's one thing for there to have had an impact on the decline in production. It's another thing for it to be recovered, and that may prove to be much more difficult. I would say you do not have to be very optimistic about the output recovery in order to believe that this program can have significant effects. Because remember, I told you that we were already starting from a conservative estimate of the effect of sanctions, which was 400,000 barrels. But even if that's not the full effect, even if it's 200,000, even if it's 100,000 barrels, 100,000 barrels a day is $2 billion. Venezuela's imports of food and medicines last year were $2.3 billion. And this year, I'm estimating that they will be around $1.1 billion. So whichever number you use, $2 billion additional dollars for imports of food and medicines will be enough to at least double Venezuelan imports of essentials. So in that sense, it would make a very significant difference. Now, if you're completely skeptical and you're saying, no, Venezuelan oil production is not going to recover, period, I don't believe it, then something that we've thought through is, or actually, I think of another way, how can you design the program so that you will have a recovery that is as large as possible in Venezuelan oil production that's directed to the program and not to other places? Well, one way that you would want to do it is by allowing and putting under the program the ability to import capital goods and to get foreign investment. But here you do get into a very important design problem, which is that if you give the Maduro regime capital goods to invest in the oil industry as a part of this program, then Maduro uses that to increase the production capacity of the oil industry, then he's going to ship that oil not to the program, but to places where he's not constrained in how to use them. So you're going to have put in capital goods to increase production that's going to end up in the hands of China and Russia. How do we stop that? Well, what we're proposing is that you could create, and this is to a certain extent a variation on the program, that you could allow for full participation of the program, each of the program, by joint ventures. So let me give you an example, and I'll use a very specific example. Chevron participates in two active joint ventures, which are Petropiar and Petrobuscan. There's actually an open discussion as to whether their license is going to be renewed, because in principle that should have stopped if they had not been granted a license as a result of sanctions. So what we could do, what you could think about, is that Chevron, or rather Petropiar and Petroscan, because they're minority owners in these firms, could commit to devoting all of their oil production, all of its oil production to the program. Now, once you do that, then you can think of ways in which, through the program, you let in capital goods come into the production in this joint venture, in these fields, because this firm will already have committed to putting all of its oil production under the control of the program. I actually like the idea of doing it with Chevron for two reasons. One of them is that if you have oil industry executives there who are U.S. persons who are subject to U.S. law, therefore can be very careful about this effectively operating in the way that it's intended. But also because you could use the renewal of Chevron's license to pilot a program of this type. So maybe if you have doubts, and many people have doubts as to whether a program like this would work, or even doubts as to whether Maduro or not would accept it as that have been put forward, well, maybe we could see whether there would be acceptance of a small-scale program with Chevron, and that way we can test out and see how that program works and see what needs to be modified before you go to a larger program. So my answer then to the question is that if you're going beyond goods that are going directly to attending the humanitarian emergency, then you do have to think through this type of mechanisms that assure that those goods, for example, in terms of capital sector, capital goods for the oil industry, are not going to end up being used by Maduro to deviate and siphon resources off from the program.
Let's take one final round of questions. Anybody in the audience? Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. I'm Andrew Bunker from the Center for Economic Policy Research, and I'm wondering if you could detail the impact of sanctions on food production and food imports in Venezuela.
On what?
The impact of the sanctions on food imports and production in Venezuela. So looking at the root cause there, and I understand that you want there to be international agency in selecting the humanitarian aid, but to what extent does food itself play in the program like this?
Could you repeat the last part of the question? Sorry.
And so to what extent would food itself play into the humanitarian aid, this program? I know it's up to the international organizations, the advisory board's discretion, but is food a key issue at hand here?
I wanted to tack on one final question, and if you use my role as moderator here to ask you, so there's real reasons to wonder whether Maduro himself would agree to this, but I'm wondering, since we're here in Washington, and we're heading into an election year that promises to be rocky, in which Venezuela will certainly be a key issue for the Trump campaign. What are the incentives to sell the current administration on this plan? What real incentives does the U.S. government have in this? And also, how would you sell this to the leadership of the National Assembly, to why those team?
Yeah. Let me start out with that last question. I think that probably the Trump administration is the one that's most difficult to convince because, as David pointed out, it's very easy, particularly for a Republican administration, to fall into the Cuban narrative, and there's a sense in which there's no political cost given their constituency, and there are potentially significant political benefits from maintaining a sanctions policy, even if that sanctions policy does not work in generating its intended effects. So I think that ultimately the Trump administration is probably not going to care that much about anything that does not have very specific observable effects on the probability of regime change. So if anything, they're likely to be unenthusiastic about this type of proposal. I do think that you are getting dynamics here in election year, which we have to see how it plays out. And I would be looking a lot as to how this issue plays out among Democrats. I do think that with Chris Murphy's article There's already an open debate. I'd like to see, for example, what are the positions taken, or if this is a question that actually gets put forward among the Democratic contenders, and if they start taking positions with respect to a program like this, or with respect to the effect of sanctions. So you could see the debate, because I think among the Democrats, the debate is going to move somewhat differently, and this idea that U.S. policy may be creating perhaps unintended but still negative consequences for Venezuelans, and that this exemplifies the failure of the Trump administration. I mean, there's kind of a reason why Christoph's article is such an appropriate article for the public of the New York Times, and it's that this is the type of thing that Democratic leaning voters are. This is the type of narrative that they're generally open to. Even if the Trump administration was trying to do things right, it messed it up and it created a worse situation. So I do think that you can get a political debate where maybe this ends up being a non-issue, they just don't talk about it. And that pretty much has been the case up until now, or when they talk about it, they just emphasize the areas of consensus. But I do think as we start going forward, there could be the possibility of there being a more open debate. I may be revealing a bit here my pessimism, and I hate to be pessimistic because I know that there are Venezuelans in the audience and there are Venezuelans listening to us who would really like to be optimistic and to think that change is coming sooner. But I do think that we have to be prepared for this being for the long haul. And in that sense, I think that if you look at the type of consensus building and of institutional design that's necessary for this type of programs, then it's very hard for me to envision that a program like this will be in place, say, earlier than a year from now. And what that means is that there's also a lot of political dynamics. We could be talking about a different administration here in the U.S. Even if we're talking about the Trump administration, there will be a second-term Trump administration. And generally, second-term administrations are somewhat different in terms of their policy priorities from first-term administrations. So that dynamics may also significantly evolve. In terms of the Guaido group, I would say that, and I've talked about this a lot with people on the Guaido camp, and I find that particularly those who understand the political dynamics and those who are the closest to being politicians as opposed to just saying just technocrats. And by the way, this is not to be little technocrats. I consider myself a technocrat. But I do think that the politicians, they understand this message of if we're going to go to elections, first we need a way to take the control of food distribution away from Maduro. And they understand that, and the people who have really tried to get votes out in Venezuela in the barrios, they will tell you that immediately. They will immediately latch onto this part of the argument because they know that it's hard to get people to vote for you, and it's hard to get the people who are voting for Chavismo to stop voting for Chavismo, given the set of incentives that Chavismo has generated. I also believe it's very clear from every opinion study made in Venezuela that sanctions are highly and increasingly unpopular among Venezuelans, the economic sanctions. And what's interesting is that if you look at opinion studies, the number of people who believe that sanctions will impact the economy adversely actually hasn't changed that much, say, from February. But in February, there were still a lot of people who were saying, yes, but I don't care, because that's a cost that I'm willing to pay if it's a cost of driving Maduro from power. But now you have to go tell those people, well, we didn't drive Maduro from power, you still have to pay the cost. That's why they're more popular now, not because people have changed their minds about their effects, but about their effects on the economy, their economic effects, because they've changed their minds as to their effectiveness. So I do think that Guaido needs a different narrative. But this whole strategy, and to a certain extent, this is also true for the Trump administration, the strategy of maximum pressure only makes sense if you are going to achieve regime change in the short term. Once you understand that you're tackling a long-term problem, then you need a strategy designed for the long term. And sanctions that hurt the Venezuelan economy, that create collateral effects on Venezuelans, this is not part of a reasonable political strategy for a long long-term protracted political conflict. And I go back to the question of the person from CPR. Venezuelan food imports have contracted essentially proportionately with Venezuela's overall imports. That means that by and large, Venezuelan food imports right now, they're about 1/10 of what they were in 2012, which is the relationship also for Venezuelan imports, for all the Venezuelan imports. This is interesting. It actually is telling you that the Maduro regime is not prioritizing food imports. You know, you would have expected, based on their narrative, you would have expected that as general imports were cut, if they really cared about protecting, and it's not that I believe this, I don't, but they claim that they do, cared about protecting food and medicines for Venezuelans, that the share of food and medicines would have gone up. And the share of food and medicines has not increased. It essentially has remained constant over time. However, that said, then it is true that if sanctions have, as I believe and as they've argued here, if they have had an effect on Venezuela's capacity to generate foreign currency revenue through exports, then they have also had an effect on Venezuelan imports. And if they've had an effect on Venezuelan overall imports, total imports, then they've had an effect on food and medicine imports. And here is where, for example, I still kind of continue to be surprised by this idea, this argument that's been put forward of Maduro is stealing all of the money, and therefore sanctions are irrelevant because it's just taking away money that he was stealing. This is an argument that actually was kind of recently voiced by Abrams in an interview that he gave. And the reality is that in order for that argument to make any logical sense, you would have to argue that not a single gram of food was entering Venezuela and was going to feed Venezuelans, and that is patently false. But if the government was stealing, say, 90% of it, and 10% was getting to Venezuelans, and you cut imports by 2/3, then that 10% is also going to decline by 2/3. And actually, if you believe that this government is kleptocratic, then you probably believe that they're going to take money out of the food imports rather than the money that was going that they were stealing. So in that sense, I mean, for me, it's actually very hard to escape the conclusion. And anybody who knows anything about the Venezuelan macroeconomy will understand that if you take an economy like this, you take away a big chunk of oil revenue from it, this is going to have an effect on the economy's growth, it's going to have an effect on the economy's living standards, and it is going to exacerbate the country's humanitarian crisis. I continue to be surprised by seeing so many people utter the argument. It's almost become a commonplace in Venezuelan discourse of the crisis began before the sanctions, therefore the sanctions have no effect. This is really a non sequitur from a logical standpoint. It is the logical equivalent of saying that you cannot kill a terminally ill patient. I mean, it is if I, walking out of Wola, get run over by a bus and I get sent to a hospital, and then in the hospital I end up contracting a virus, and I end up dying from that virus, I don't think that the hospital, if my family or my descendants try to sue the hospital, that the hospital is going to say, oh, well, he would have died anyway because of the impact that the bus had on him, therefore the virus had no effect. I put this example to lawyers, and they just, this sounds not even like an introductory law course argument. It just sounds like a schoolboy's, and it's so simple that they say, of course, no lawyer would ever utter that argument. So why are we seeing people who should know better, and let me just leave it at that, uttering that type of argument? I think that they do a very strong disservice to serious public discussion. The reality is that the fact that the crisis began before the sanctions, it tells you that there is an alternative driving factor which had an effect on Venezuelan living standards in the 2014 to 2016 period. And we all know what that was. That was a huge collapse in oil prices for an economy that was unprepared to handle it because Chavez had not saved enough during the oil boom. He had saved basically none of the oil boom. So this economy had to contract imports when oil prices fell. We know that that happened. We also know that oil prices recovered after 2017, and that ceteris paribus, you would have expected the Venezuelan economy to recover just because of the increase in oil prices, and we know that it didn't do so because oil production started declining. So there, the real important discussion is what has been the effect of sanctions on Venezuelan oil production. And here, what I would take as the result from, or at least my interpretation of this whole discussion in which, of course, I participated, is that I haven't seen anybody make a serious case that the oil sanctions have not affected oil production. And as I already argued, even Hausman and Musi actually conceded that point, that they expected the oil sanctions to affect oil production. Well, that by itself is enough to tell you that there's something quantitatively important here in terms of living standards. Then there's an issue of how we interpret the decline after 2017. I've done some research using synthetic group estimators there, and it points to a very large effect of oil sanctions. I've also looked at within industry variations. For example, the fact that the only joint ventures that actually saw production stabilize or increase after the financial sanctions were the Chinese and Russian joint ventures tell you that there's something there. I mean, something happened in 2017 which affected the Chinese and the Russians differently from how it affected the European and the American investors. And it seems natural for me that that is exactly what you would, to conclude that that is exactly what you would expect would happen if you impose financial sanctions which impede US financing, and they also de facto impede European financing because no European entity is going to come in and finance something that is subject to US sanctions, and in fact none of them did, but it does not impede Russian and Chinese financing, which has a set of other different considerations, and which we know was provided after the sanctions. So I think that the evidence is there, that's there is also strong. So in other words, given the whole marshalling of this evidence, I think that there is no way right now to argue that the sanctions have not had at least some significant effect on Venezuelan living standards, and that Venezuelans' lives would not be better right now if these sanctions had not been implemented, particularly because the sanctions didn't even bring in the intended effect with which they were going to benefit Venezuelans, which was ending the Maduro regime. Now, that said, I don't think that holding that position necessarily makes you an opponent of sanctions. There's very much of a difference between kind of normative considerations and positive considerations in economics. And particularly, the way that I'm thinking about this, and the way that I think that we researchers should look at it, is we're essentially studying the side effects of a treatment. Now, there are other researchers who are studying the effectiveness of that treatment. So the research that David cited regarding whether these sanctions bring about a regime change or not, well, those are the guys who are actually testing whether if this new therapy diminishes the illness that it was designed to try to cure. And they may come to the conclusion of, better do away with them because these have no effect. Then at the same time, you have other researchers who are looking at the side effects. And the purpose of looking at the side effects isn't necessarily to say, you could find side effects which are so serious that you say, okay, we better do away with the drug, even if it does have some of the intended positive effects. But another way that you can think about it is, this is the way in which you design complementary therapies that also allow the recipients of this drug, which might have positive effects, to tackle with and deal with the collateral effects or the secondary effects of the drug.
Well, thank you very much, Francisco. We are out of time. I do want to just very quickly mention that this event was part one of a two-part series of events. We are co-organizing this with the Tulane University Center for Inter-American Policy Research. Stay tuned for a second event focusing exclusively on the impact of financial oil sanctions in Venezuela in early 2020. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to everybody who is tuning in for watching. And a round of applause for our panel.